Hey everyone, welcome to Pages and Pours. My name is Robert. Happy weekend whenever you happen to be seeing this. It's being posted on a Friday afternoon, so kicking off the weekend right. Tonight I have one of my standby bourbons. One of the things that got me into whiskey in the first place was Maker's Mark, and this is the Maker's Mark 46. As some of you know, I just went on the Maker's Mark tour earlier, 2-3 weeks ago. In fact, my car is still in the shop from the little mishap on the way to Kentucky. I've got my Maker's Mark glass that they gave me at the tour. Bill Samuels Sr., the guy who started Maker's Mark, after he was getting to retirement age, his son, Bill Samuels Jr., was taking it over. His father basically gave him the commandment that thou shalt not screw up my good whiskey. Do what you want as far as expanding the company in different ways, and Samuels was a good advertiser, a good marketer. But Bill Samuels Jr. realized he wanted to leave his mark on the distillery as well, so he didn't change his father's original recipe. What he did is he started experimenting with wood staves as a finishing process with the whiskey that they were already producing. So what they did is they started doing a bunch of different recipes of a group of 10 wooden staves that they essentially put on a big key ring and with spacers, so the staves are separated and the whiskey can interact with the wood, and they just drop them into a barrel and they finish them for 9 extra weeks in a special warehouse that's kept at a maintained temperature of 50 degrees. They found that the cooler temperature actually helped it mature for those 9 weeks exactly. And they tried a bunch of different recipes, and they ended up finding 10 virgin French oak staves to go in the whiskey. And that's what became Maker's Mark 46. And the reason it's called 46 is it just happened to be the 46th recipe that they chose as the one that they wwere going to run with. And this is part of their standard core line now. It's still very affordable. It's in the $40 range. It's 47% alcohol by volume, so 94 proof. It's very tasty. And this led to the wood finishing series that, if you've been following Maker's Mark at all, they just completed their first chapter of what they'd called the wood finishing series, where they tried different types of wooden staves in combination with each other. The same way, taking them, putting them on a big giant key ring, dunking them in the barrel and leaving them in the barrel for 9 weeks and finishing them that way. But the regular Maker's Mark 46, they use the same configuration of French oak staves every time. And I just find it's got a little bit of extra little spiciness. It's not hotter. I think it's the same ABV as the regular Maker's Mark, but it's just really delicious. And the Maker's Mark 46 cask strength is absolutely terrific. I just had that recently for the first time, and I'm a huge fan. That's going to be, they've just changed their mind on that. They were putting it out periodically before, but now they decided that they're going to do that as an annual release each year. So once a year, there'll be a production of Maker's 46 cask strength, and then it'll go away again for another year. So I bought an extra one. Anyway, Maker's Mark 46 is one of my favorite go-to bourbons. It's a wheated whiskey. If you're familiar with the way bourbon is made, it has to, by law, be 51% or more corn. And usually the second grain in that recipe, in the mash bill, is rye, and then the third one is malted barley. Well, Maker's Mark uses red winter wheat instead of the rye. It's a little bit softer, it's a little bit sweeter, and I just happened to fall in love with it first, and so Maker's Mark has always been one of my go-to favorites. Vanilla, brown sugar, a little bit of baking spices, but mostly just gorgeous sweetness. I have to say that I find this a little bit tame after having been drinking the cask strength recently, but that's just because it's relative. But for somebody who's just getting into bourbon, this is not going to blow your face off. The ABV is very approachable, and if you find it at all hot, you just throw it over a giant ice cube and drink it that way, which is the way I drank bourbon for the first 2 or 3 years before I got into whiskey. I still, on something that's really high proof, I will put over ice because it's just too intense for me. But I love it. It's great. That going into the 46 warehouse is probably my favorite part of the Maker's Tour because, of course, I like Maker's 46 and the cask strength so much. And we got to taste it in the warehouse too. But it's also because it's so cool in there. It's 50 degrees and I like it cool, especially when it's so hot outside. So that was a pleasant part of the tour for me. Anyway, I hope you've had a chance to try Maker's 46 if you like bourbon. Even people who don't like wheated bourbons often will still like Maker's Mark. So very, very good whiskey. The other thing that's interesting that I didn't realize until I went on the tour is that Maker's Mark may be the only big bourbon distillery, or one of the last few bourbon distilleries, that still does barrel rotation by hand regularly. Their warehouses, except for the one for the Maker's 46 finishing, their regular bourbon warehouses are not climate controlled, and so it's very hot in the high parts, cooler at the bottoms, and they want a very consistent batch each time they put out more bourbon, and so they rotate the barrels so it evens out the effects of the heat and the cooler temperatures. And that's a lot of manual labor moving those barrels, because those barrels, when they're full, you're talking about 500 pounds a piece. So pretty intensive labor to get exactly the flavor profile consistency that they're going after. So I'm a big fan of Maker's Mark. It's not the kind of bourbon that bourbon aficionados or connoisseurs, snobs, really rave about, but I think it's a terrific bourbon. And I love all their stave finishing projects, and they have individual barrel picks now where a group can go and choose what kind of combination of 10 staves they put into the barrel that they're buying and bottling. And so there's lots of those barrel picks around that are fun to experiment, because each one that has a slightly different stave profile, and you can get some different flavor profiles that way as well. Okay, so enough about my love of Maker's Mark. I am going on another distillery tour at the very end of August. I'm going to Buffalo Trace, which is I think it's in Frankfort, Kentucky, which is not too far from Lexington. It's kind of in between Lexington and Louisville, if I remember correctly. And that is the distillery that produces so much whiskey that no one can ever find. First of all, I think Buffalo Trace has caused their own problems to some degree because they produce about 9 million different brands of bourbon. If they focus those selections a little bit more, it might be a little easier to get bottles of their stuff. But they've also just made a massive plant expansion where they are doubling their capacity for the future. So when that comes online in a few years, that's going to be a real help to the market, because right now anything that Buffalo Trace puts out is immediately gone in stores. So I'm going there at the end of August for my second big bourbon distillery tour. Okay, what else has been going on? I have not done a ton of reading over the last week since I last talked to you. I thought that this being the off season for my football club, Newcastle United, go Magpies, that I would have nothing but time to read, and it hasn't turned out that way. Partly because there's so much excitement around the club right now that they've qualified for this coming season in the UEFA Champions League. No one ever thought they were going to make top 4 last year, because the year before they almost got relegated out of the Premier League. So they went from a relegation battle one year to qualifying for the Champions League 12 months later, which is just unheard of. But there's so much excitement about the Champions League that this offseason, during the transfer market, there's been a lot of speculation about players that we're trying to bring in because we need to beef up the squad. We don't have enough players to add a fourth competition over next season. There's just too many more games now going to be on our schedule for the squad that we have. They just physically can't play that much football. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that's going. So every day I'm reading the news, who's been linked to the club, what's the status of this potential target, things like that. And most of it's just gossip and rumors, but it's interesting and enticing. But also the women's team, which just became professional over this summer. They'd been a part-time squad in the 4th division last year. They won the 4th division last year, so they moved up to the 3rd division this year and went full-time professionals. The first full-time professional women's team, I think, in the 3rd division ever. And some of the players, of course, had to leave the squad because they couldn't commit full-time to it because of other occupational commitments that they had. And so we've had to bring in some signings for the women's team, and the last 3 or 4 days they've announced, I think 4 now or 5 now, brand new signings, some from upper level clubs that are willing to drop down a level to be part of this new professional project. So that's been really exciting. And to make it even more of a black hole for my time, many of you know that I am a statistics geek. That goes back to my days when I was a financial columnist for several years, wrote a couple books about the stock market and statistical analysis, and then I was a private portfolio manager for a number of years, and so I've always been a stats guy. And the UEFA, the European League oversight group, has announced that they are changing the format of the Champions League, not this coming season, but the season following. And that new format was announced just recently, and there's a lot of implications about that have been interesting for me to dig into and try to figure out. The way it works is just like the World Cup in the past. They had 32 teams broken up into 8 groups of 4. Within your group of 4, you played each team twice, so you played 6 group games. And then the top 2 teams advanced into the knockout phase. The other 2 teams are eliminated. And they discovered really quickly that in a lot of the groups, year after year, you'd have 2 really strong, powerful clubs and 2 maybe not so strong, powerful clubs on that level. And so the group stage would all be but decided halfway through, and the last couple of games were just kind of dead boring. And they're trying to avoid that. So they've changed the format considerably. They're adding 4 more teams, but they're changing the format for the first stage and then the knockout stage. And I actually think I like the new format, but it's a little bit complicated to figure out. So I've been doing stuff like that instead of doing as much reading as I thought I was going to be doing. It's very hot, so I'm not spending any time on the bike outside, and I haven't had the motivation to ride inside, so I'm not really riding much. I'm not really reading much. I'm just digging into all my different rabbit holes from my life and my football club. But I have been reading a little bit, and I mentioned last week that I'd started French Braid by Anne Tyler. This is her 24th novel, I believe, and it's the 4th novel since she said she was retiring. So, and I'm glad she's continued to write because I've enjoyed her recent books. This book, like her other books, is a domestic drama. It's about a family that goes on their first and only family vacation. I believe it was 1959, right before I was actually born. And then it follows them up until pandemic time. So basically a 60-year look at this family and its generations. And this book is a little different from her other books. Anne Tyler does not write blockbuster plots. They're not huge revelations. These are typical families with typical family issues and things that bring them together, things that pull them apart, as any family does. And this family has a husband, a wife, 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy. And at one point early on in the book, you see the wife starting to pull away from the husband, not because she wants necessarily to be away from him, but she wants more autonomy. She wants to be a painter, and so she rents a studio. Basically, she rents an apartment somewhere, and it turns it into a studio, and she spends more and more time there, and he feels like she's leaving him, and in some ways she is, in some ways she's not. The kids are all very different from each other and don't really grow up all particularly close to each other. And the way this book differs from her other books is that, first of all, there are a lot of characters through the generations. And Tyler is not really developing all of the characters like she did in detail in her earlier books. It's more broad strokes in this one. She's making comments about families and about society and about kind of old school feminism, which is now out of favor perhaps, but it fit the time period she was writing about. Also about the roles that the daughters take and how different they are. One of them is your very staid and steady, rock solid type. The other one's boy crazy and flighty and doesn't stick to anything. And the son's kind of an outlier in that family. His father doesn't really connect to him, doesn't understand him. And so you got all these kinds of issues as this family goes through their decades, and then they have families, things like that. So it's interesting. If you're interested in Anne Tyler, but you don't know where to start because she has written so many books, I would start with one of her earlier ones, The Accidental Tourist. Possibly the most perfectly plotted novel in the 20th century. I just think it's terrific. It's about a man who he's grieving. He and his wife lost their son. I believe the son was killed in like a drive-by shooting or something. It is Baltimore. No aspersions on Baltimore, but Baltimore has its problem with guns. But I believe that they are now separated. He's kind of living alone. He's a travel writer, but he hates to travel. He wants to make it as much like home as he possibly can and make it as pain-free as possibly can. So he's the accidental tourist. And I just think it's a brilliantly plotted book. I studied it quite a bit when I was thinking about writing novels myself, and I just thought that's just a perfectly plotted book. That's a great model to learn from. But I also like her writing style back then. So if you're interested in trying something from Anne Tyler, pick up The Accidental Tourist, paperback, library, whatever, and give that a try. If you like any of her books, you're going to like most of her books because they're all very similar. She writes, some people condemn her for writing in too folksy a way. I don't see that. I think that's being snobbish. I think she writes about real people, well, real middle-class white people, let's put it that way, and real middle-class white people problems. And I just find it intriguing. I think she does a terrific job about looking into family psychology. So I am not 100% finished with this one, but I'm close enough to know how it's going, how it's developing, and I like it a lot. Critics mostly liked it, and I tend to agree with the reviews I've read by the people who have liked it, so I'm in that camp. The other two books I have here I've not started yet. I need to start on The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, rereading that one fairly quickly because next Wednesday is the July live stream, and we're talking about Oscar Wilde on that live stream, at least for a little while. So I need to get busy and reread that one. And then the other book I've got here from the library is another one of the 48 books from this year's BookTube prize field that I have challenged myself to read. And I don't have a copy of it, so I got it from the library, and that is Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger, which is the first of his last 2-book series that he wrote before he died just recently. I have never read a Cormac McCarthy novel, which is kind of strange because he's a pretty big deal. I started reading The Road, but got busy and never went back to it. I've meant to read Blood Meridian. He's written so many that are kind of iconic, but I have never finished one. So I'm going to at least read this one, and if I like it at all, I'll go back and pick up Blood Meridian and The Road. So those are the books that I'll be reading in the near future. I am going to Atlanta at the end of the month to watch Newcastle play, and they're doing the English Premier League has sent, I think it's 6 teams over to do a preseason, not really a tournament, but a preseason event here in the United States along the East Coast. They're playing in 4 different venues. I think each team plays 3 games. So Newcastle's playing in New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, and I'm going to the Atlanta game. That's the closest one and the easiest to get to for me. And that's against Chelsea, I believe. And I'm also, while I'm there, it's a doubleheader. The other game is Brentford against Brighton. So I'll get to see 4 Premier League teams in person. I've never been to a Premier League game in person before. I've been to English games before, but not Premier League. So that's going to be interesting, even though it's preseason. It'll be fun for me. And I'm doing that, and then I'm going down to Buffalo Trace at the end of August. So I've got a couple more trips planned. Still haven't gotten on a plane again, but I am doing some road trips. And then I've got to start planning 2 international trips, replanning my trip to Seoul, South Korea, that I was planning when we got shut down. And then I want to go to Scotland to do distillery tours and just enjoy Scotland for as much time as I can spend there. I've been to Scotland before, but it was long before I got into whiskey. Didn't know anything about whiskey at the time. So now going back with a different interest in mind, it'll be a lot of fun for me. So I think that's everything that's going on around here. I hope this lighting is better than last week's. I tried an experiment trying to move my lights around to do some different things, and I just got it all wrong for my last video. Sorry about that. I'm hoping this is a little bit better. I'm trying to decide if I want to invest any money in better equipment, and I'm not convinced yet that I need to or really want to. So I'm kind of balancing on that edge. I'm not going to do it this month because the expense of getting my car repaired is setting me back this month, but maybe in the next 3 to 6 months. Anyway, I hope you have a good weekend. I'm not sure exactly what the Monday video is going to be yet. I'm still working on a couple possibilities, and I'm also putting together a pool of samples to start doing some blind tastings probably on Wednesdays. I think I'll wait till I get back from Atlanta to start those. I put together a list of 60 bottles that I have here at home from a variety of different styles of whiskey, and I'm putting them all in identical bottles, and I can't memorize the numbers, so they're just random numbers. I'll pick one out, taste it, try to decide what it is as well as I can, not necessarily the brand or the distillery, but whether it's a Scotch or a bourbon or an American single malt or something international, Irish whiskey, could be anything. And then tell you what I think maybe the alcohol volume is within a range. We'll see if I can get anything without the hints of knowing what's in the bottle. I have a feeling it's going to be comic relief because I have a feeling I'm going to be terrible at it, but it's going to be fun to find out. Anyway, so that's the plans for what I have got in the works for the next couple of weeks and months, and we'll see how it goes. So I hope to see you on my video on Monday, and then I hope to see you on Wednesday for the live stream, whether you drink whiskey or not. Oh, by the way, on the live stream Wednesday, I'll be sipping the Lagavulin Distillers edition, and I believe it's the 2022 or 2023 bottling. I'm not sure which. So if you want to sip along with me, grab some Lagavulin. If you want to drink tea or coffee or whatever you want to drink in your glass is your business. And if you haven't read The Picture of Dorian Gray, that's okay too. We talk about all sorts of stuff. Just come by and visit. I try to keep it under an hour. So we'll do that on Wednesday. So a couple more chances to check in with you over the course of the next week. All right, everybody, have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.